Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the virtual presentation of our fourth briefing on Cuba, recent Cuban immigration and its principal economic and social repercussions by Dr. Alejandro Portes and Ryan Bagwell. My name is Jorge Duani, and I'm the director of the Cuban Research Institute at Florida International University, which organized today's event. The series Briefings on Cuba is a collaborative project among the Cuban Research Institute, the Kimberly Green Latin American and Caribbean Center, and Casa Cuba. I especially want to thank LAC Director, Dr. Anthony Pereira, and Maria Carla Chiquen, the former Executive Director of Casa Cuba, for their support. A special word of acknowledgement as well to Dr. Maite Morales, Program Manager of Casa Cuba, for her work on the layout and design of our briefings. Also wanted to mention that today's briefing will be available to download on the websites of the CRI, Casa Cuba, and LAC after today's presentation. If you wish to receive a hard copy of the essay, you can write us at cri@fiu.edu, and we'd be happy to send you a copy. Before proceeding, let me remind you that you can submit questions during and after the lecture in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and then I will compile those questions and post them to our authors after the presentation. I'm very pleased to introduce our guest speakers today. Dr. Alejandro Portes is Professor of Law and Distinguished Scholar of Arts and Sciences at the University of Miami, as well as Howard Harrison and Gabrielle Beck Professor of Sociology Emeritus at Princeton University. Born in Havana, Cuba, he came to the US in 1960 as a political exile. He received his PhD and MA in Sociology from the University of Wisconsin at Madison and his BA in Sociology from Creighton University. He's taught at the University of Illinois, Urbana, Texas, Austin, Duke, and Johns Hopkins before joining Princeton. In 1998, he was elected president of the American Sociological Association, and in 2001, he became a member of the National Academy of Sciences. He has published approximately 275 books and articles on comparative urbanization, national development, immigration and ethnicity, and economic sociology. In 2019, he received the prestigious Princess of Asturias Prize from the Kingdom of Spain. On a personal note, I want to say that I have known Dr. Portes for many years, and I have used and cited his own work in my research, especially his pioneering work on the Cuban enclave in Miami, but also his work on the informal economy and more recently, globalization and global cities. Ryan Bagwell is a PhD student in the Department of Sociology and Criminology at the University of Miami, where he focuses on the intersection of race, sports, media, crime, and organizations through a multidisciplinary approach. He completed his MA in sociology at California State University, Fullerton. Without further ado, I give you my esteemed colleague, Dr. Alejandro Portes.
Well, thank you, Jorge. It's a pleasure to be here with you and with the with the virtual audience of this event. It would be I would welcome the reactions later on, but in the interest of time, I may as well begin this commentary that is, as you pointed out, is already in print and as a briefing of the Cuban Research Institute at Florida International University that you direct. One of the most notable features of that rather durable Cuban revolutionary regime has been its reliance on immigration as key moments of its political and economic evolution. Opposite to the experience of other countries behind the former Iron Curtain, Cuba never endeavored to keep the population tightly secure within the island from the very start of the revolution. Fidel Castro let dissidents escape and conflicting, that is, heaping contempt on the dissidents, calling them worms and confiscating their properties, but allowing them to leave the island. That singular attitude, contrasted with other Soviet bloc countries that Cuba joined, had many advantages, but also risks. The Cuban government benefited by increasing its internal political control through expelling opponents and in the process appropriating their wealth. On the risk side, these groups concentrated across the Florida Straits, organized militarily, and sought to retake the country. Fidel, despite these efforts, and never feared them much. And actually, he was proven right in April 1961 by the swift and rather ignominious defeat of the invasion brigade by the Cuban armed forces. The Cuban regime was consolidated by the solution of the missile crisis of 1962, by which the United States committed itself not to invade the island in exchange for the removal of Soviet rockets from it. Thereafter, Cuba had little to fear militarily and politically from its exiled population. After 1962, the United States, and especially South Florida, became convenient disposal grounds where revolutionary authorities could dump the disaffected within the country at regular times. For that purpose, the Cuban regime adopted the practice of periodically opening a port to allow dissidents to leave. There, an early rehearsal took place in the port of Camarioca in the north coast of Matanzas province in the fall of 1965, when close to 3,000 people left the island on boats rented or bought by Cubans already living in the United States. The Camarioca episode then served as a precedent for the much larger Mariel exodus of 1980, and that well-known event started with a political commotion in Havana as hundreds of Cubans climbed the fences of the Peruvian embassy seeking asylum from the regime. And rather than keeping them bottled up in the embassy, the Cuban regime opened the port of Mariel, inviting relations to those wanting to leave the island to just come and pick them up. It was a masterful political move, compounded by the government's decision to empty the jails of petty criminals and packing them on the boats of the unsuspecting arriving exiles, along with what they call other undesirables. So in one fell swoop, the Cuban government relieved internal political pressure, proved to the outside world of its openness and willingness to compromise, and got rid of thousands of scum, as both the political escapees and the common criminals were labeled. Another plus for the regime was the way in which Mariel permanently tarnished the image of the exiled population in the United States. Previously regarded as a model minority and the builders of the new Miami, Cubans were demoted after that episode to the lowest range of the US ethnic racial hierarchy as potential criminals and as vagrants. So the effect of Mariel on Miami, and in particular on its exile community, were profound and actually last to our day. Suddenly cast in an extremely negative light by the American public, many pre-Mariel Cuban exiles responded by creating economic and social distance from the new arrivals from Cuba. The derogatory term Marielito made its appearance at that time. Indeed, the networks of cohesion and solidarity, which had been so crucial in the survival and subsequent economic advance of earlier exiles, were withdrawn from the Mariel arrivals. With time, this new population became gradually incorporated into the South Florida economy, but the damage was already done. The Cuban exile community of Miami became progressively bifurcated into the pre-1980 exiles and their children, almost uniformly white, and quite successful in the American entrepreneurial, artistic, and academic worlds, and Mariel and post-Mariel arrivals, often relegated to the working class and to fringe municipalities in the Miami metropolitan area. The personal and family incomes of pre-Mariel Cubans doubled those of Mariel and post-Mariel arrivals by 2010. The incomes of pre-1980 Cubans and their children topped 90,000 per year, significantly higher than the entire Miami metropolitan population and almost double the figure of the incomes for Mariel Cubans and post-Mariel arrivals, as demonstrated in an analysis that I did some years ago, that was published in my book on Miami, The Global Edge, with Professor Ariel Armoni, and the data can be seen there. For many years, the Cuban government actually remained unaware of the rift that its policies had caused in the exile community. For the government, that population was the exile population was an undifferentiated whole of defectors led by anti-communist cabal of politicians, which Cuba called the Miami Mafia. The city and its environs remain essentially a dumping ground for the disaffected in Cuba. However, the partition of the exile community since the Mariel episode began to have significant social and economic consequences as years went by. By 2010, the pre-1980 Cuba population of Miami was at par with the native white population in terms of yearly family incomes. And by contrast, the post-1980 Cuban population suffered a significant economic handicap, a deficit of about $14,000 a year for those who arrived between 1980 and 1989, and an insurmountable over $30,000 deficit for those who came after 1990. These negative figures, or the bifurcation, economic bifurcation of the Cuban community of the Miami metropolitan area, held even after controlling statistically for gender, time in the US, work experience, and type of employment. These economic differences translated especially in what may be called the different life projects of pre-1980 and post-1980 exiles. The all exile population and their children settled in upper, middle, and upper class areas of the Miami-Dade metropolitan area, such as Coral Gables, Coconut Grove, Kendall, while post-Mariel Miami refugees went to live in working class communities, initially the inner city area that eventually was baptized as Little Havana, and then in sizable municipalities like Hialeah. In terms of the different life projects, the pre-1980 exiles gradually abandoned their hopes of returning triumphantly to the island and settled instead into their American lives. Their tangible economic success devolved into the attendance by many of their children of private bilingual schools in Miami, and then entrance into elite American universities. Gradually, the concerns with Cuba and the hope of return faded away from this population. Older exiles coming at that time have been dying off, and their children turn increasingly to their American lives and goals. For them, Cuba became steadily a nostalgic and rather fading memory. Not so for the newer refugees. They had been educated by and under the revolution, and their departure was motivated much less by the goal of defeating politically that regime than by allowing their families within the island to live in better conditions. And for that purpose, once they got settled in Miami or elsewhere in the United States and found employment, one of their first priority was to send remittances in money and kind to their relatives on the island. So that a steady flow of resources followed, gaining quantitative and qualitative importance with time. The older exiles generally took a rather dire view of these activities, regarding them as a significant benefit for the Cuban regime. Prominent members of the Cuban American political machine in Miami, including Florida Senator Marco Rubio, more than once sought to stem the inflow of new refugees from the island. Clear evidence of the rift between the two blocks of the Cuban exile community came in January 2017, when shortly before leaving office, President Barack Obama suspended the wet food, dry food policy of allowing free entry into the United States for Cubans who arrive at the southern border. And at that point, not one voice in the rather powerful Cuban American political establishment of Miami rose in opposition to Obama's measure. Although this establishment was uniformly composed of Republicans, and the end of the inflow had been decreed by a democratic president, that policy change agreed fundamentally with the point of view of the older exile community. Precious little sympathy was found in this community for the life projects of their new companions. Back in 1928, Professor Leland Jenks, a reputed US historian in the North, published a book called Our Cuban Colony, a book that chronicled the profound dependence of Cuba and its prime industry, sugar, on the United States. That book became a classic and went on to serve as reference material for later economists and historians. So, and it took actually a single lifetime, 63 years of revolutionary regimes, revolutionary government in Cuba to turn the tables, because in more than one way, Miami today had become a colony of the island. Old-time exiles would surely find this statement absurd, and probably they would be joining that judgment by most journalists and social scientists. But consider the facts. First is the concentration of the Cuban population in the Miami metropolitan area. By 2020, the US Census reported that 1,001,000 Cuban-born persons resided in the Miami metropolitan area, which is a figure that more than double the sum total of Cubans living in the next 14 largest areas of concentration, including New York City, Jersey City, Tampa, St. Petersburg, and Orlando. Of the 73,000 persons granted lawful permanent residence in Miami-Dade County in 2019, the last year before the pandemic, 1/3 were Cubans, the figure being far larger than any other nationality, including Haitians, Jamaicans, and Venezuelans. Over 90% of Cubans admitted at the southern border as refugees before the end of wet food, dry food policy intended to move here to South Florida. Second, the demographics of the Cuban population have changed steadily with the gradual disappearance of the pre-1980 exiles and the substitution by more recent arrivals that by now, post-1980 Mariels constitute the majority. And third, the life project of this more recent population, as we saw before, does not focus on defeating the revolution, but on promoting a better lifestyle for their king and friends on the island. So consider now the parallel with colonists in the 17th and 18th century leaving their European metropolis, Spain, Portugal, England, and France, to settle in the Americas. They came to make their fortunes here, and indeed many succeeded in that goal. Their home countries encouraged that migration for the wealth it created and eventually brought back to the home country. In parallel fashion, many Cubans emigrate today to make their fortunes in the United States, largely for the benefit of their families left behind. While for many years the Cuban government considered Miami just a dumping ground for dissidents, in more recent time, its leaders have become increasingly aware of the economic significance of the remittances in hard currency and in goods of all kinds, as well as the growing commercial traffic with South Florida. That traffic, both formal and informal, is evident in the greatest areas of Cuban concentration in South Florida. In Hialeah, for example, teams with all kinds of small businesses with connections to the island, from travel agencies to automobile shops that package replacement parts for Soviet cars and ancient US models for transport by returnees to the island. The final phenomenon illustrates the parallel of Miami to the old European colonies in the Americas. In the 19th century, many enriched Spanish colonies in Cuba returned to their mother country to the applause of their families and the cities where they had returned. In Spain at that time, they were called Indianos because they had been returned from what the Spain called the Indies. They were, by an ironic twist of history, the Indianos of nowadays do not come from Cuba, but from Miami, to be received with gratitude and admiration by the families and communities that are left that have been left in the island. And let me conclude by summarizing some of the recent developments that have happened with Cuban migration in the last 12 months. In September 2022, U.S. Customs and Border Protection reported that close to 200,000 Cuban citizens had been apprehended seeking to enter the United States during fiscal year 2022. That figure is about 80,000 more than the total arrivals during the massive Mariel exodus of 1980. And reasons for this new exodus are worth noting. The situation of generalized poverty and intense political repression has continued in Cuba and actually have become worse after the harsh official reactions to the public protests of July 2021. Indeed, the push to leave the island had been a near constant for about half a century, only getting worse in recent months. So the key factor in emigration is what happens at the receiving end, which overwhelmingly is the United States. The termination of wet food, dry food in 2017 would seem to spell the end of near free entry at the borders, leaving only penurious and expensive ways of trying to escape the island, like processing of visas by the U.S. consulate in Georgetown, Guyana. But then, last year, a new ray of hope appeared with the discovery, not by Cuban, but by desperate Central Americans, of the complex and rather dysfunctional American asylum system. By law, in the United States, any person arriving at the border and claiming asylum is entitled to a hearing, if not immediately deported for an obvious false claim. The person then enters the American asylum system. Incapable of housing so many people at the border, the Border Patrol and Customs and Border Protection agents then release the person, often with a tracking device, but otherwise free to go anywhere in the United States. And given the backlog of cases, court dates assigned to asylum claimants are often months away, and the process can extend for years because of legal rights also to appeal the denegation of asylum by an immigration judge. The complexities of the American asylum system means that a person can remain legally in the United States for actually a longer period than legal temporary immigrants working in agriculture and other sectors of the economy. For Cubans in particular, this Kafkaesque character of the US asylum system is still more advantageous because of the Cuban Adjustment Act, a relic of the Cold War from the 1960s, which entitles any Cuban person who has lived in the United States for a year and a day to claim legal residence. The act has never been abolished, and in combination with a rather slow asylum processing system, provides a ready means to gain legal permanent residence in the United States. Hence, there is no mystery that about the quantum increase of Cuban outmigration in recent months. Not surprising either that the bulk of new arrivals, about 200,000 in the last fiscal year, are single adults, mostly men, sent by their families to make their futures in the United States. Unless the situation changes at either end of the flow, we can predict confidently that it will continue indefinitely into the future. New Cuban asylum seekers would move almost inevitably to South Florida, there to increase the low-wage labor force and hence reinforce the peculiar 21st century colonial relationship of Miami and with its unsuspected island metropolis. For over half a century now, the relationship between Cuba and South Florida has moved in multiple directions and gone from one extreme to the other. The peculiarly named wet food, dry food policy, agreed by the Cuban and US governments to put an end to the rafter crisis of 1994, allowed a steady flow of escapees from the island for over 2 decades. The termination of that policy in 2017 would have seemed to spell the end of mass Cuban immigration. but this has not been the case for the reasons that we have just seen. Each episode of this long saga of migration from Cuba has, has come about suddenly and rather unexpectedly. And based on that history, it is likely that new surprising developments will take place in the future. The current policy of the Biden administration amounts to a de facto continuation of wet food, dry food, in which Cubans apprehended at sea are normally returned to the island, while those arriving at the southern border or that make land in southern Florida are let in. The change in status from refugees to asylum seekers, as they are called now, is purely nominal, since after a year and a day, they become eligible for permanent US residence. The present Democratic administration appears helpless to stem the Cuban inflow, as does the much larger one from Venezuela. Only a drastic reform of the US asylum system would modify the situation. But until that happens, Cubans and others will continue to avail themselves of what many perceive as their only and probably golden opportunity to enter the promised land. Of late, the Department of Homeland Security has announced a rather complex program of cooperation with Mexico to send back Venezuelans and Cubans who fail to comply with a series of new requisites for entry, including applying for asylum in the sending country. But it is unlikely that this reform, as framed at present and announced yesterday by the Secretary of Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas, will succeed in stemming the flow either from Cuba or from other sending countries. Only a significant reform of the present asylum system will accomplish that. If the US asylum system is finally reformed, a task that falls on Congress, a better policy would be to maintain and expand the program of orderly departures from Cuba set by both Cuban governments after the rafter crisis of 1994. That would allow individuals and families wishing to leave the island to do so in a legal, dignified manner, avoiding the enormous risk of crossing several countries and jungles and so on in order to arrive at the US border, risking their lives aboard improvised vessels in the Straits of Florida. Whether that happens in the future or not remains to be seen. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Portes. I just want to make sure that everyone remembers that they can submit their questions on the Q&A button at the bottom of their screen. And also, I wonder if Ryan Bagwell wants to say something before we turn to the questions. Ryan?
No, I'm good. Dr. Portes hit what he needed to. So
okay, great. So we do have a couple of questions, and I have several of my own. So let me start just to break the ice for Dr. Portes and Ryan, if he wants to participate in the discussion. I want to ask you, Alejandro, about your last point regarding the asylum system, which you characterize as Kafkaesque and dysfunctional. So can you give us a little more detail as to what you would propose to reform the system?
Well, the asylum system is, as presently, is rather absurd, because in the absence of holding facilities at the border, U.S. officials of the Border Patrol and Customs and Border Protection are forced to release people, asylum seekers on their own reconnaissance with a court date months away. 4 months afterwards, who knows if they are going to show up at court or not? And if they do, and their petitions are rejected, they still have the right to appeal. So one thing after another, it means the de facto entry into the country of a population that is legally in the country as asylum seekers, but that is denied work permits and so on. So this population ends up in the informal economy. Venezuelans, Nicaraguans, Hondurans, and Cubans who have arrived that way are not going to return. It's a de facto entry program that the American administration doesn't know what to do with. From the point of view of the United States, in order to reform this system that it started to resemble Ellis Island, in which whoever wanted to come can come, and that is, it would be necessary to set up humane, large-scale reception facilities at the border, and to increase by a quantum number the immigration judges that would hear the cases, so that asylum seekers can be granted their legal right to a hearing and even to an appeal, but in a relatively rapid process of time. Those being successful turn over to the Office of Refugee Resettlement for processing and assistance in setting in the country, and those who are not sent back. This is a rational policy from the point of view of the receiving nation. But what is happening now, however it is disguised by the press and by the administration, is a de facto free entry program for those who people from Central America, Cuba, and Venezuela who manage to make it to the southern border.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions and comments from John Suarez from Center for Free Cuba, basically in the same direction. So I'm going to summarize. The question is, doesn't Frank Calzon's condemnation of President Obama ending wet food, dry food policy in January 2007 contradict the statement that no Cuban exile leaders oppose the policy?
Could you repeat the question?
The question refers to the condemnation of the ending of wet food, dry food policy by Frank Calzon in 2017, and there's a link as well to that op-ed. So, and also John Suarez said that he loudly condemned the move to eliminate it at the time.
Well, I don't want to speak for Frank Calzon or whoever said and whoever condemned this policy. The policy actually, when it was worked rather well, and though it was absurd that it was a kind of a lottery. If you were caught at sea, you were returned. If you managed to make it to the border, you were let in. But it was a way of channeling the flow. It had to end, but it was never substituted by anything that would respond to the enormous pressure in the island, and also by relatives already in the United States, for people to continue coming. It is absolutely necessary. It had been absolutely necessary to devise an orderly departure program from Cuba for people meriting entry into the United States, and often be received by their families. That was not done. That was not done, and in lieu of that, now the U.S. administration is confronted with this situation at the border that it doesn't know what to do with. In the past, there were very few asylum seekers. It was sort of exceptional, so that the police agencies of the American government, like the U.S. Border Patrol and ICE and Custom Enforcement, focus simply on catching those who try to cross the border clandestinely and returning them to the island. But what has happened with the discovery of the asylum system, is that nobody tries to move. Very few people try to cross the border clandestinely these days. They simply present themselves in front of a U.S. immigration officer to claim asylum, and what happens next is what I have described. These are the people that today huddle in the streets of El Paso and other border cities, having nothing to do. They were let in and they don't have work, they don't have nowhere to go, or who are bused by the governors of Texas and Florida to northern cities. They are to be held in shelters that were originally built not for asylum seekers but for the homeless, waiting for weeks and weeks for a court hearing that may or may not come, and meanwhile trying to find their ways into the informal economy. This is a crazy system, and it's really unsustainable. So basically, that is both for the general asylum seeking system, as had to be reformed, as I mentioned before, and for Cuban immigration, as I mentioned in the last sentence, there is a need for set up to reinstate the orderly departure program that was set up after 1994, with and increasing it so that the flow can become can become orderly and rational rather than the irrational scene that we are seeing at present.
Thank you. We have a question from our friend and colleague Uba Aragon, and she wants to know if you think that the new policy of granting 30,000 visas a month to Cubans, Nicaraguans, Haitians, and Venezuela who are claimed by sponsors in the U.S. will lower the amount of asylum seekers in the border.
Jorge, can you repeat it?
Okay. The question is, do you think that the new policy of granting 30,000 visas a month to Cubans, Nicaraguans, and Haitians claimed by sponsors in the U.S. will lower the amount of asylum seekers in the border?
That's a great question, and it's the right question to pose on this case. It would lower it minutely, but it would not end the pressure at the border. This is simply that is the policy that was announced by Secretary Mayorkas and so on, of letting people, 30,000 people come in that apply in their countries of origin and demonstrate that they have a U.S. sponsor and so on. It's a diversionary maneuver. It's a diversionary maneuver by a government that does not have anything better to offer to try to keep people who are in sending countries by providing this potential avenue for escape and entry in the United States. But consider the facts: how many of would-be asylees have sponsors? The supply of sponsors in the United States is not endless, even for Cubans. And the idea of applying for asylum in the embassy of the country that you want to go to from your country is intrinsically absurd. If you really want to escape for a real fear of persecution and so on, you escape. That is, the asylum system is set for people who are persecuted and who have to leave. But that is applying from the home country through the embassy and finding defectors that is potential sponsors and so on is contradictory to the spirit and the motivations in the international law for setting up asylum. In short, I think that is this policy set up by the Democratic administration would not work. It would not even work if it was successful facing the challenges of 39 Republican governors that are opposed to it for reasons that don't make any sense. It will not work because it's not enough to alleviate the tremendous pressure of people seeking to leave, both for economic and political reasons. And only a thorough reform of the American asylum system would solve the present situation.
Thank you. So we have a question from Olympia Gonzalez, and she wants to know if colonization means that the Cuban government will be able to infuse communist and radical ideas to the political scene in Miami. And are we in Miami ready to accommodate to Cuba, or should we try to influence the incoming immigrants?
Could you repeat the question?
Does colonization mean that the Cuban government will be able to infuse communist and radical ideas to the political scene in Miami? And are we in Miami ready to accommodate to Cuba, or should we try to influence the incoming immigrants?
Thank you. I think that using the analogy of our colony of Miami is simply to say that this is what is happening in reality, because for many of the more recent arrivals, there, as I mentioned, their life project is to try to make life better for their families and communities in the island. That is exactly what migrants from any other country have done for Nicaraguans or Filipinos or Indians. The Cubans simply have abandoned the status of real exiles opposed to the regime as it was in the 1970s and 80s to become another immigrant group seeking to make their fortunes here. The Cuban government cannot use this population to try to alter the political balance or political orientations in Miami, because not only the Cuban orientation is decidedly anti-regime and anti-communist, but those people who arrive today, even if they go back with remittances, are not in sympathy to the government that forced them out. They are not going to become a spokespeople for a failed revolutionary experiment. What the Cuban government is doing at present, the regime is tacitly benefiting from the flow of resources that are motivated not by people sympathizing with the regime, but motivated by trying to improve the terrible conditions of life in the island for their immediate families. But indirectly, that becomes a de facto flow of remittances to the island. I think that politically, this population of more recent arrival is rather inert. It is not, it doesn't militate often in any, it's simply concerned with the life project, which is basically to survive in this country, find some kind of job, primarily in the Miami metropolitan area, and increase and make life better for the families. And at this point, I am going to turn to my co-author, Ryan Bagwell, so that he give us some statistics about the economic difference, the real economic differences that are often forgotten between conditions in the island and conditions in the major metropolis of reception, that is the Miami metropolitan area, right?
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Portes. So one of the biggest things we need to consider is the economic power that is in Miami and has developed over time. So one of the things we see when we're looking at gross domestic product of Miami, the newest data out is on 2021 that puts GDP of US dollars at $186 billion for the county of Miami-Dade. Last year, 2020 numbers, it was right around 162 billion. And so that's just Miami-Dade County. When you compare that to Cuba during 2020, the GDP in real US dollars was 107 billion. So the economy of Miami-Dade County outpaced all of Cuba, at least when you compare 2021 to 2020, by roughly, what is that, $79 billion between those two. But the numbers become a lot more striking when you look at the per capita distribution of GDP. So that's taking your GDP and dividing it by how much population size you have. So in Miami-Dade for 2020, GDP ends up being about $61,000 of GDP per person who lives in Miami-Dade County. Now, when we turn and look at Cuba for that same time period, GDP is right around $9,400. So again, we're talking 61,000 for Miami-Dade, 9,400 for Cuba, which just shows that economic advantage of moving over to Miami, and just the possibilities of coming here, both in the formal and informal economy that's built around them, and being able to send those remittances back to Cuba.
Thank you, Ryan.
No problem, Dr. Portes.
Okay, so moving on, we have a lot of questions. I don't know if we're going to get to all of them, but following the order, I see them in my screen. The next one is by Juan Fernandez. who remembers that the pre-Mariel Cuban community, as opposed to other communities, was considered an enclave. And I think actually Alejandro Portes is the one who coined the term. Do you have any data or insights about whether that situation has changed, meaning the Cuban enclave in Miami?
Yes, I think that it is very different what we have at present. Juan and Jorge, that is the enclave was created, the Cuban enclave that rose in the 1960s and 1970s was created by the exile upper and middle classes of Cuba that proceeded to take positions in the local banks, provide loans for businesses and so on. If you have read my work on the enclave, remember there was something in the 1960s and 70s called the character loans. These were loans by local banks issued by Cuban loan officers at the time to would-be Cuban entrepreneurs that wanted to start their businesses and had no capital at that time. They were in the magnitude of $10,000, $15,000, $20,000, $1960 and $1970. And those loans were made without collateral, that is, without any guarantee of repayment, just on the basis of the reputation that the recipient had on business in Cuba. That's why they were called character loans. And that was a key factor in the emergence of the Cuban economy of Miami at that time and its power to propel the economy of Miami into becoming what it is now, an emerging global city. But those character loans ended even before Mariel, because the people who were the officers that were granted the loans did not know the new arrivals, especially they did not know those who had arrived during Mariel. So the networks of mutual assistance and financial support that propel the success of the earlier exiles were taken away for a number of reasons for the more recent arrivals. So there is no enclave in that sense at present. What we have, for example, in Hialeah is a huge informal economy that is underground economy, connecting with the island in multiple ways, but essentially offering a myriad of employment, low wage employment for people. But as I document in the course of this presentation, Juan and Jorge, the differences in terms of economic situation between the pre-1980 exile and their children, because most of the pre-1980 exile are now dead, but their children and grandchildren that have managed to climb the American economic hierarchy are now in professional positions and do it. And the situation of the economic situation of more recent arrivals is enormous. It's enormous. Basically, what we have at present in the areas of concentration of the new Cubans, including
Okay, I think I'm seeing
in the informal economy. That situation is no different from that of Nicaraguans or Mexicans in California and so on, indicating that the more recent Cuban flow comes to resemble the other working class flows from the rest of the Americas. And it's rather distinct, and its economic path, although they had managed to survive and do so, will not be or will not reproduce the history that was enacted in this city in 50 years ago.
And a follow-up question by Sara Moreno from El Nuevo Herald. If you have any figures on the businesses created by the most recently arrived Cubans, say in the last 5 years.
I have not looked at the businesses, and I think that is something that we should look around. we should look in detail, because my sense in exploring the areas of concentration of this population in the lower income areas is that this population is also that is the new Cubans, the population post 1980 and the more recent, are also very entrepreneurial. What happened, that is in the sense of trying to explore whatever economic possibilities, and we find them everywhere. The problem is that in order to succeed in business in America, that is to make it to viable enterprises like the ones that were created half a century ago, you need capital. That is, you need somebody to loan you. Now, at that time was $20,000. Now we're talking about 50, 100,000 to start a minimal business. And there are not that many people who can do it. So what happens is what we have, although I admit that I do not have the figures, and that this is a task either for myself or those who come after me in exploring the economics of the Cuban American population, it is very clear that there is a lot of inventiveness in terms of improvising businesses that go from cleaning houses to creating small food stands, to selling flowers, and so on. And the reason for this, what you might call grassroots or low-level entrepreneurialism, is precisely the economy from which they come from. That is the situation of a scarcity and poverty in the island prompts much of this population, including young people, to find ways to survive economically in a situation of permanent scarcity. That as you and I know, that those activities have a name in Cuba. It's called resolver. You have to resolve somehow the situation, and resolver translates in Miami into resolver through improvising whatever source of income. Let me give you an observation that is real, that Ryan and I have, and that I have observed to complete this this answer. That is, after the new exodus, the arrival of these 200,000 new asylum seekers looking to take advantage of the Cuban Adjustment Act, and that were overwhelmingly directed from the border to South Florida, I came back to this area in October to tour the areas of high concentration of the Cuban low-income population. In other circumstances, one would expect that the arrival of tens of thousands of penniless refugees or asylum seekers, as they are called now, would lead to a chaos in the streets. People begging in the streets, sleeping in the sidewalks, sort of overwhelming the social services of the populations with the populations in the areas where they came to. Nothing like that has happened. Nothing like that. One can travel through Hialeah today, or through Miami Lakes, or through West, or through Sweetwater, and you don't see anything. Nothing in the external appearance of the city and its urban life have changed. And the reason why that is, these people have been literally sucked up by the metropolitan economy of Miami. First has to do with its size, as Ryan mentioned. It's a huge economy, almost twice the size of the economy of Cuba. Second, it has to do with the fact of the scarcity of labor, because old-timers and many other ethnic groups in the United States do not want to take this sort of low-level service jobs. So there is actually the level of unemployment in Miami day to day is one of the lowest in the nation. How is that compatible with the arrival of tens of thousands of penniless asylum seekers from Cuba? It is compatible because of the size of the economy, the need for labor, and the inventiveness and grassroots entrepreneurialism of people that manage to survive in Cuba and somehow are using these skills to survive in the Miami metropolitan area. So that is the positive side of the story. We are not having a massive influx of poverty. We are not having, that is, people are managing to do. But on the other hand, I want to restate the fact that this population will not create a new enclave in the model of 50 years ago because of the absence of high-level entrepreneurial skills and because of the absence of capital.
Thank you. We had actually another question by Javier Cortada, I'm sorry, regarding the absorption of today's Cuban immigrants in Miami, but I think you've answered that question already. So I'm looking at several questions we have pending. I will turn to one by our colleague Lisandro Perez, who notes that given the bifurcation you have discovered in the socioeconomic structure of the Cuban American community, what questions should field research on the community address to further understand that bifurcation?
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, I think you're having a lot of echoes on your side. So the question is, given the bifurcation that you have discovered in the socioeconomic structure of the Cuban American community, what questions should field research on the Cuban American community address to further understand that bifurcation?
Thank you. And a question from my friend Lisandro Perez. Thank you. I think that the phenomenon of the enclave, the phenomenon of the bifurcation of the Cuban community, both spatially and economically, is granted. There is no reason to research it even more. It would be simply raining on what is already wet.
Okay, we seem to have lost Professor Portes. Hopefully he will come back soon. But it doesn't look like the Zoom technology is working for us.
Among Cuban Americans of that generation. What needs to be studied now are the new arrivals. What is happening? Because what I have offered you are observations but we need actually to carry out both, that is the studies of on the basis of aggregate statistics and studies on the ground, including the situation of the children attending schools in the Miami metropolitan area. Listen, Lisandro, you know this very well. We did a study of children of immigrants in this area many years ago, and nothing like that had been done, despite the fact that actual studies, including by Professor Fernandez Kelly, who is in the audience as well, show the enormous differences in education and opportunities and outlooks between children of earlier exiles attending private academies, including those that were set up by religious orders here in Miami coming from Cuba, like the elite Belen Jesuit, Columbus, and others, and the population of children of Mariel and post-Mariel attending Hialeah High. Hialeah High is something to behold, at least in these years, in terms of the typical inner city school with bars in the windows and security officers and so on, and being very detached from what used to be the experience in this area of earlier exiles and their children. That was documented back in the studies by Fernandez Kelly and others in the late 1990s and the 2000s. Now we do not have studies of that kind, and I would submit to you that one of the frontiers of research, and also to Jorge, who is the director of the CRI, that one of the frontiers is to carry out field work, that is surveys of this young population that we can spot where they go to school, what they are, and carry out the studies of their views, their aspirations, their performance. So we can renew our knowledge of this. In many ways, Lisandro and Jorge, I admit to you that my own knowledge is dated. The only thing that we have now are aggregate statistics that we can work, and you can see, of course, the difference in average incomes between Hialeah and Coral Gables, in median incomes in housing owners. Ryan and I are exploring Miami. Not only the Cuban community. Miami is bifurcated. It's completely a fragmented global city in which there are areas of great wealth and extraordinary entrepreneurialism, and areas of great poverty, both in the native African American communities and in the more recent and less so in the Latin communities. Coming to that, but these are based. What we can do are aggregate statistics. It would be an agenda and a project for the future to go back to the field and try to answer authoritatively the question of what would be the future of this Cuban American population.
Thank you. I think we have time for one last question, and I will ask you a question by Ada Ortuzar Young, who notes that you mentioned the difference between political attitudes of the first Cuban migrants of the 1960s and the more recent immigrants. So can you elaborate on the support of the recent immigrants who seem to be re-electing the older generation Cubans, who apparently don't follow the same desires, goals as the younger generation?
Well, if I understand the question, that is correct me, Jorge, if I am. That is the question: what is the difference in political attitudes between successive generations of Cuban exiles coming into this area? Well, the answer is obvious. It's contained in a sense, it's contained in this briefing, this Cuba briefing that is published by FIU and that I have summarized here. The earlier exile generations of the 1960s and 1970s had a life project, and that life project was to return to the island. People did not want to stay here. They had a life, and they had hopes for Cuba as an independent country. So these are that was and even after the defeat of the Bay of Pigs, and even after the missile crisis, those same attitudes remain and resulted in a that is, it transformed themselves. These attitudes of the earlier Cubans transformed themselves into a powerful political bloc here in the Miami metropolitan area in favor of the Republican Party and right-wing causes. For many years, the Cuban vote in Miami, that was denoted by this earlier generation of exiles and their children, was a very powerful element in Florida politics, to the point that many that is attributed the very tight win in 2000 by Bush to against the Democratic candidate, to this bloc, to the fact that the Cubans in South Florida voted in bloc. That has faded away with the disappearance of these earlier exiles. At present, there is, I think, much less of an interest in attitudes. I think that overall, what we see in the more recent ways from Cuba is a relatively apolitical orientation. Not that they would not participate, but there is no project to follow the earlier generations in creating political and military opposition to the regime. That is, these are young, for the most part, younger people who grew up and were educated under the revolution. So one finds them, at least the casual meetings that I have had with many members, many recent arrivals, that their life view and their project is largely apolitical. It's not to overthrow the regime. It's not to construct a new Cuba, but rather to make their lives here, to improve their economic situation, and eventually to not only to support their families in Cuba, but eventually to bring them here. So it is, this life project is no different from what Mexican immigrants, where Filipinos and others have done done in the past. And I repeat this: what has happened with post-Mariel migration is a growing convergence between the outlooks and the life views of recent who have the same idea, not of overthrowing the Mexican regime, but on making life better for themselves and their families inside Mexico, just like happening right now.
Okay, thank you, Alejandro, and thank you, Ryan, as well. That's all the time we have for today, and I want to thank again everyone who joined us. And before we end, I wanted to invite everyone who's here in Miami to our book presentation that Alejandro Portes and Ariel Armoni will be doing at Books and Books on March 3rd at 7 o'clock with their latest work on global cities, including Miami. So thank you all for attending, and see you next time.